GWR, the Great Western Railway.
It crossed over rivers, was blasted through hills, and hundreds died in its construction.
And this gigantic, wonderful, radical piece of engineering was conceived and designed as a whole by one man, Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Brunel's chosen field of engineering was tough and competitive. Many other players were jostling for the top jobs. George Stephenson had just built a fast-moving steam-powered line from Liverpool to Manchester, the world's first intercity railway. Major towns and cities needed their own engineering visionaries to keep their futures on track.
At the beginning of the 19th century, Bristol was still considered to be England's second city. The Bristol merchants were losing out to their upstart rivals in the north.
To hold on to its status, Bristol needed to find an engineer it could trust to improve its transport links with London. And Brunel seemed to be the ideal choice.
In 1831, 2 years previously, the brilliant young engineer had won a competition. He had beaten the great engineer Thomas Telford. The idea was to build a bridge over the Avon Gorge, 214 metres wide and 75 metres deep. Brunel's design was for a single-span suspension bridge, the Clifton Suspension Bridge.
The technology and know-how to build big suspension bridges had been around nearly 100 years, but Brunel's design was on such a grandiose scale that it required some very careful calculations. The competition rules stated a maximum load on the supporting chains of 5.5 tons per square inch of chain. Brunel worked out a design that would place a load of only 4 tons per square inch. His nearest rival was more than 6 tons.
It ends up with this absolutely perfectly balanced suspension bridge. And every time a vehicle goes across the bridge, you can see it's absolutely perfectly balanced. Look. It floats above the Avon Gorge.
It was a mathematical masterpiece and let Bristol know that Brunel could tackle difficult engineering problems and come up with radical results.
They had in their engineer the right man in the right place at the right time.
In 1833, Bristol's newly formed railway company saw the potential an energetic Isambard had to offer and commissioned him to build their steam-powered line from Bristol to London. But it wasn't going to be an easy journey.
After Brunel's initial preliminary study, a much more detailed survey was needed. Assistants were employed, and Brunel was to superintend the whole business. His first diary entry reads, "Up at 5, and the following weeks were much the same. Long days in coach and on horseback searching for elusive assistance, and long nights in inns poring over maps and estimates. He confessed to a friend, 'Between ourselves, it is harder work than I like. I'm rarely much under 20 hours a day at it.'"
It took him nearly 2 years to complete his plans. The hills and rivers he plotted all posed major headaches for his dream of providing the fastest, smoothest railway possible.
Brunel decided on the flattest possible route from Bristol to London. Went south east to Bath, then on to Reading and London, giving him a gradient of rarely more than 3 metres per mile.
On his railway, Brunel wanted the tracks to be built as level as possible. The more inclines, the slower the journey would be, and the more fuel his engines would use.
Although he had completed his plans by November 1833, it wasn't until the last day of August 1835 that the bill to build the Bristol to London line received royal assent, after some epic parliamentary battles. One hearing lasted 57 days and cost the new company £88,710 in expenses, an unheard of sum. Brunel's cross-examination was a gruelling 11 days, but it was a brilliant performance. One of the crowd of landowners and engineers that filled the committee room said, his knowledge of the land surveyed by him was remarkably great. He was rapid in thought, clear in speech, he never said too much, nor lost his presence of mind. I cannot remember having such an intellectual treat as that of listening to Brunel's examination.
What Brunel didn't say to the parliamentary committees was to prove his genius. In the new Railway Act, he hadn't mentioned the type of gauge he was going to use. He was ready to put forward his big idea.
Brunel wanted to build the fastest, smoothest railway in the country. And just because George Stephenson had started using a gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches didn't mean that all railways would have to be built to that dimension. So Brunel chose a broad gauge, 7 feet from rail to rail. That was a huge increase in scale. It meant he could have bigger locos. They could be faster. He could have bigger carriages. They would be bigger, better, very exciting, a lot less northern.
Using his charm, Brunel soon convinced his backers that his broad tracks would work. He'd surveyed his route, he decided on his gauge, and everything seemed to be in place for him to start building the Great Western Railway.
But it was still not a foregone conclusion to use a broad gauge. Brunel himself had said that if the Great Western Railway was forced to share a terminus at Euston with the London and Birmingham, we would have to abandon our gauge. Fortunately for Brunel, an alternative site was found. Land was purchased, at great expense, from the Bishop of London at Paddington for the terminus of the Great Western Railway.
With all the permissions granted and land purchased, he now began to forge his Bristol to London route. It was hard, back-breaking work, and his wide lines caused total devastation to the surrounding countryside.
Brunel was 30 when construction started in 1836. There were hardly any precedents for civil engineering projects of this size, apart perhaps from the pyramids.
Without heavy machinery like this, Brunel needed some real muscle to take on the challenge of building his line. Navvies were employed, many of whom hadn't built railways before, mainly because there hadn't been many railways to build.
Here's a quote. I think as fine a spectacle as any man can witness who is accustomed to look at work is to see a cutting in full operation, with about 20 wagons being filled, every man at his post, and every man with his shirt open working in the heat of the day, the gangers looking about, and everything going like clockwork. It was a fine sight to see the Englishmen that were there, with their muscular arms and hands hairy and brown. A navvy, given good conditions, could dig a trench 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 36 feet long in one day, and lift it all above his head.
As the navvies cleared the way for Brunel's broad lines, parts of the railway were starting to take shape. But he was about to hit the first major construction problem that could destroy his iron road to London.
However careful you are about avoiding obstacles, and Brunel's Great Western Railway was often jokingly referred to as the Great Way Round, sooner or later in the United Kingdom you come across a major obstacle. And this was Brunel's, Box Hill. Couldn't go over it, had to go through it. The normal method followed by canal and railway engineers was to keep your bore as small as possible, but that wasn't Brunel's way. He was going to drive 2 7-foot broad gauge lines through this hill. This is Box Tunnel. At nearly 2 miles long, it was the greatest railway tunnel ever attempted and an infamous piece of engineering if ever there was one. It couldn't be dug out, it had to be blasted.
Brunel's navvies were forging his iron road across the south of England. The work was gruelling, and in places like Box Tunnel, it was also extremely dangerous.
Tunnels would sound their ground, looking for fractures. There's one. So that's going to come down very easily. Then after you've drilled your hole, you prepare to set your charge. They would have been using black powder, gunpowder. For the purposes of demonstration, this will represent dynamite. So the black powder would have been fed into the hole, and then just like a gun, a muzzle-loading gun on a Napoleonic ship, it would have had a wad behind it. So if we pretend that's our charge, and this is our tamping rod here, hang on a minute, wood, no sparks, and then you would have tamped the charge home. If the rock hadn't already fallen on you, and by the time you drilled this you hadn't put any more down, this was probably the most dangerous portion of the job yet, because this can become a projectile.
The pressure to build the railways fast meant that health and safety was never a major concern. Construction of early railway lines maimed and killed many of the brave men that built them.
One of the things they used to do was use a piece of quill, slice that and add more black powder, and then jam that in, and then once you'd laid your charge, used a naked flame, another nice safety feature, to light your fuse, and then, traditionally, leg it!
How fast you had to run depended on how long you'd cut your fuse.
That's got him. Of course, the thing that nobody's allowed to say is that people kept doing things like this because it's exciting. The tunnel consumed a ton of candles and a ton of gunpowder every week. 100 horses and carts pulled the 30 million bricks to line it. Who counted them? It took 5 years to finish Box Tunnel, and apart from using steam pumps to clear water and blasting powder, it was all done with muscle, men and horsepower, but at a terrible cost. Over 100 men lost their lives, and many, many more were seriously injured and maimed. And in the days before anaesthetic, it doesn't really bear thinking about. Bath Hospital used to resemble a field dressing station during a major battle. Brunel was once showed a list of 131 men maimed and seriously injured during a 20-month period. He said, I think it is a very small list, considering the very heavy works and the immense amount of gunpowder used.
It wasn't just the loss of life at Box Tunnel that was a problem for him. People weren't keen on travelling underground either. After all, it was a bit closer to hell. But Brunel was never deterred from making big decisions or trying out something new.
Brunel turned the accepted wisdom of how to lay a railway completely on its head. There are no transverse sleepers, which is how we imagine, that's our image of what a railway track bed looks like. There's great gaps here with ballast in here because these are the sleepers. They run longitudinally. The rails are laid on top of them, they're tied at intervals, here, and then it's spiked every now and again with piles driven into the earth. What happened, and what contemporary inspectors criticised, was that in between the sleepers tended to sag, so you got this strange switchback ride. But it shouldn't just be dismissed as eccentric, because at the time the London and Birmingham Railway was using the Northern Colliery method of stone sleepers, and that was a very hard ride indeed. So Brunel had surveyed his route, he'd got his contractors and his navvies. What he needed now was engines. He wanted the fastest, most reliable broad gauge loco he could get. But remember, he was a civil engineer, not a locomotive engineer. And he laid down some strange stipulations. He was obsessed by weight and low centre of gravity, and he ended up with a collection of 18 locomotives from various builders that formed a real motley crew, some of which contemporary sources said were barely capable of pulling their own weight, let alone a train. Fortunately, he had employed as his first locomotive superintendent another young genius, a man called Daniel Gooch. Daniel Gooch had served his time in ironworks and foundries from South Wales to Scotland, and by his late teens he was already a fully qualified locomotive engineer. In 1836, aged 19, he went to work for the Robert Stevenson Company at Newcastle, and there he worked on 2 broad gauge locomotives destined for export. He was fascinated by the possibilities and said he was delighted to have so much room to arrange the engine. So, when a job came up at the Great Western Railway the following year, he applied immediately. Brunel was delighted with him, engaged him on the spot, and the first thing that Gooch did was persuade Brunel to buy one of the Stevenson locomotives, the North Star. North Star wasn't without its teething problems. They just couldn't get the power out of it. They thought they could. So, Brunel and Gooch, who proved to be the most pragmatic of engineers, worked on a new blast pipe, and its improved performance amazed everybody.
By increasing the size of the blast pipe and making sure that the steam discharged in the middle of the chimney, they had created an engine which could go faster using less fuel.
It was by far the most successful of the first GWR engines, and Gooch used it as a prototype for a whole new broad gauge class. And this is the first of them, a replica being built at Didcot, Firefly. There were 62 in the class. They had 7-foot driving wheels. On the first trial, it went from Paddington to Twyford, 31 miles at an average speed of 50 miles per hour, which was unheard of. On June the 4th, 1838, the first section of the line was opened from Paddington to Maidenhead. Actually, it only made it as far as Taplow because there was a small problem at Maidenhead, the Thames.
All Brunel needed to do was just design a little bridge for his trains to cross. A simple task for an engineer who had just drawn up the plans for the grandest bridge in Bristol. Or was it?
Maidenhead didn't want another bridge, they'd already got one, thank you very much, on which they made quite a bit of money charging tolls. And the Thames Commissioners wanted to make sure that the river was still free for barge traffic. So Brunel came up with what is commonly called an engineering triumph. The Maidenhead Viaduct. Because the river still had to stay open for navigation, Brunel was only allowed one pier in the centre of the river. Now, if he'd have built a traditional arch bridge with hemispherical arches, each arch would have to have been 64 feet high, much higher than the bank on either side. He would have had a humped-backed viaduct, not very practical for a railway. So he came up with this daring and simple solution. He flattened the arches.
Brunel's secret was in the maths. His pages of sketches are surrounded by detailed calculations. He had projected the force on every part of the bridge with great accuracy. Brunel had worked out how to design arches longer and flatter than any others built before.
Each one is 128 foot wide, rising to only 24 foot in the centre.
He didn't have an electronic calculator. Amazingly, he worked it all out by hand. The rest of the engineering world thought that this would be Brunel's greatest failure.
Doom was prophesied. Too flat, it won't stand. Unfortunately, when Chadwick, the contractor, removed the centering, that's the form, the wooden form that the arch was built on, from the eastern arch, this one, it did sag very slightly. But Chadwick took the blame. He said that he hadn't waited long enough for the special Roman cement to set. And of course, it's still here, and it's still a viaduct.
And it's all down to Brunel's mathematical genius. His great iron road between London and Bristol was nearing completion. But at Box Hill, his eccentric and extravagant plans were running into problems.
Supposed to be finished by August 1840, by December 1840, work had fallen so far behind schedule that Brunel threw 4,000 men and 300 horses working in shifts to try and complete his missing link on his Bristol to London line. Finally finished in June 1841, and it marked the end of Brunel's epic 8-year struggle to build the line. No wonder he put a nice porch on the front of it.
Isambard had accomplished his grand vision of a broad gauge line from Bristol to London and had kept his promise to the merchants of Bristol to keep their city on the map. His broad lines were eventually built all the way to Penzance, and he completed his final engineering triumph, the Prince Albert Bridge at Tamar, in 1859. Brunel's brave vision of a broad gauge system with a smooth and level road, minimum gradients, great sweeping curves, best possible motive power and very high standards of design was ultimately a failure. By 1892 the battle was lost and standard gauge prevailed across the whole system. Just imagine what our railways would be like if Brunel had won.
I said, where's the handbrake? He said, it's not very good. I wouldn't rely on the handbrake. Just use the front bucket.